In September 1945, the surrender of the Japanese Empire erased the brutal, occupying authority that had blanketed East Asia for nearly a decade. What remained was an immediate, massive vacuum of power. The nominal authority positioned to fill that void was the Republic of China, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist Kuomintang party. On paper, the nationalists held international prestige as a founding member of the United Nations. In reality, the state was structurally exhausted. The government was fighting regional warlords, and the economy was suffocating under rampant hyperinflation that crippled the middle class and fueled widespread corruption. Recognizing the fragility of the situation, the United States dispatched General George C. Marshall to mediate a coalition between the nationalists and Mao's Communist Party. The mission achieved a brief armistice, but it quickly disintegrated. The ideological chasm between a capitalist, urban-focused military dictatorship and a radical Marxist movement was simply too wide to bridge. The resulting Chinese Civil War became an inevitable, totalizing struggle for absolute control of the mainland. Initially, the conflict was deeply lopsided. The nationalists controlled the major urban centers, and their forces were equipped with a surplus of advanced American armor and military funding. The communists countered with an aggressive, localized strategy. By implementing radical land reform in the rural territories they occupied, they redistributed property to millions of disenfranchised landless peasants, securing their deep ideological loyalty. This agrarian base provided the communist forces with a virtually limitless supply of recruits, intelligence, and logistical support. Using this immense scale, the People's Liberation Army rapidly evolved from a decentralized guerrilla insurgency into a conventional military juggernaut capable of high-intensity offensives. The result was the systemic collapse of the nationalist military apparatus. By the end of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of his government were forced to retreat across the strait to the island of Taiwan, while Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. To consolidate control over this massive, predominantly rural population, the newly formed state began dismantling private ownership of land, media, and industry. The state's strategy followed the philosophy of its leader, Mao Zedong. He practiced a concept known as voluntarism, the conviction that human willpower and ideological purity could bypass objective economic laws. To fund early operations like the Korean War, the government launched the 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns. Through public confessions, family surveillance, and ruinous fines, the state seized the wealth of private merchants and eliminated early political opposition. By 1956, the party momentarily encouraged intellectuals to openly criticize the government in the 100 Flowers campaign. But as dissent grew, the state abruptly reversed course, purging hundreds of thousands of scholars and critics in the subsequent anti-rightist campaign. In its first decade, the state successfully extracted hundreds of millions in private wealth and enforced ideological conformity through targeted campaigns. Total party control was prioritized over any measure of systemic stability. The ultimate test of this ideology was the forging ahead strategy, an attempt to compress centuries of industrial development into a 15-year window. During the Great Leap Forward, the state mobilized rural labor on a massive scale. Traditional family farming was abolished, forcing the peasantry into collectivized communes. To boost industrial output, local cadres forced citizens to build backyard steel furnaces, melting down tools and household goods in an attempt to surpass British steel production overnight. Diverting millions of farmers to industrial projects left crops to rot in the fields. Terrified of failing to meet unrealistic quotas, local officials fabricated yields, prompting the central government to purchase grain that the villages needed to survive. This chart compares domestic food availability against state grain exports. While the internal food supply collapses, causing a massive famine, state grain exports actually climb. At the peak of the famine in 1959, the divergence is extreme. The state maintained international prestige and urban industrialization, while the rural population was left without basic food supplies. The resulting economic devastation triggered the Cultural Revolution, a decade where state-sanctioned youth militias tore through the social fabric, turning citizens against each other to purge perceived dissidents. Subjective will could not overcome objective economic laws. The attempt broke the country's social and economic foundations. Ideological fervor alone could not sustain a superpower. Following Mao's death, the ruling party assessed the wreckage. Decades of continuous upheaval and mass starvation had reached a point that threatened the survival of the state itself. Under Deng Xiaoping, the state adopted a pragmatic approach. He dismantled the utopian mass movements of the previous era, focusing on stability while preserving the existing authoritarian structure. The new governing philosophy was practical. Economic efficiency and growth mattered more than strict ideological labels, so long as the Communist Party retained authority. The failing rural communes were dissolved. In their place, the state moved its population into synchronized, export-driven industrial labor forces. By removing the ideological friction, the state successfully channeled the energy of 1 billion people into a predictable and efficient economic engine. Decades of this pragmatic approach concentrated hundreds of billions in capital, funding the dense financial hubs of the modern era. Today, modern China functions as a massive thermodynamic machine. It requires fuel, motion, and energy to survive. Without that energy, the gears lock up. In 1976, the architect of the Chinese Communist Party died. Mao Zedong left behind a nation paralyzed, isolated from the global economy, and running on empty. His successor, Hua Guofeng, tried to stabilize the system with a doctrine called the two whatevers. It mandated resolute adherence to whatever policy decisions Mao had made and whatever instructions he had given. The real-world results of this ideological rigidity were devastating. National GDP growth sat below 5%, and the highly centralized communal farming system was unable to produce enough grain to feed the population. A system built on rigid ideology without energy generation cannot sustain itself. It inevitably collapses under its own entropy. The leadership debated the party's survival in December 1978. They gathered here for the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee. Deng Xiaoping emerged from this session as the paramount leader. He rejected the two whatevers dogma, opting for a clinical pragmatism to save the system. Deng introduced a new operational code: emancipate the mind, seek truth from facts. This signaled a pivot toward outward-looking development and an end to decades of near autocracy. These reforms were driven by a need to optimize a failing machine, rather than any desire for democracy. To save the party's monopoly on power, the leadership decoupled political survival from Marxist economic dogma. The first injection of market energy began in the countryside. The state dismantled the rural communes and implemented the household responsibility system, allowing peasants to lease state land and sell their surplus crops for profit. This tracks the annual growth of wheat production. While averaging just 2.7% in the pre-reform era, under this new system, it spiked to 8.2%. This explosion in productivity generated localized wealth, creating raw market energy for the broader economy. Deng established special economic zones like Shenzhen. These were quarantined environments designed to test global capitalism without letting it interfere with the political system. These zones absorbed massive amounts of foreign direct investment. They transformed the country into the factory floor of the world. The CCP had successfully harnessed the energy of the free market, but that energy was proving volatile and difficult to contain. By the spring of 1989, economic expansion had created an inevitable demand for political freedom. The system was reaching its critical breaking point. Internal pressure was beginning to fracture the machine's structural seams. Over 1 million protesters occupied Tiananmen Square, paralyzing the leadership and overwhelming moderate figures like Zhao Ziyang. On June 4, the state applied absolute kinetic force. The People's Liberation Army was ordered to clear the square and re-establish order by any means. In the aftermath, progressive elements were purged from the party. The leadership reasserted total civil control. This was a ruthless act of boundary setting. The party proved it would burn market fuel, but would violently crush any threat to its structure. Despite the political freeze, Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern tour mandated that economic expansion must continue. Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji were the technocratic architects tasked with building a new equilibrium between market growth and state control. Zhu Rongji oversaw a massive restructuring of state-owned enterprises, systematically dismantling the inefficient iron rice bowl that had guaranteed employment for decades. This chart illustrates the sheer human cost of that restructuring. In the late 1990s, the government eliminated approximately 40 million state jobs in a drive for industrial efficiency. This push culminated in 2001 with accession to the World Trade Organization, officially plugging the Chinese machine into global supply chains. WTO entry did not liberalize the country's politics. Instead, it integrated an authoritarian machine into the global economy. Decades of this uncompromising model have produced an economic titan. Economic liberalization does not inevitably lead to political democracy, despite long-held geopolitical assumptions. The Chinese Communist Party successfully engineered a distinct blueprint for a modern civilization. It functions as a massive engine, burning the fuel of the market while contained entirely beneath a heavy iron vault of state control. Modern China's rise represents a successful mastery of energy, entropy, and absolute control. Any massive, rapidly expanding system eventually hits a breaking point. The energy required to sustain that growth creates intense friction, and without a mechanism to contain it, the structure begins to fracture from the inside. For decades, China operated on a philosophy of decentralized expansion. Deng Xiaoping's mandate to focus on economic development successfully lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. But that same lack of central restraint incubated vast networks of graft and patronage. The skyline of cities like Shenzhen mutated almost overnight. Billions of dollars flowed into local governments and private hands, masking deep structural imbalances beneath the veneer of an unstoppable economic boom. This diversion of resources into competing power centers creates a feedback loop of disorder. Left unchecked, this internal friction erodes the state's foundation, turning rapid growth into a source of systemic instability. By the late 2000s, the Chinese Communist Party was heavily fractured. Different factions controlled varying sectors of the state apparatus, and ideological cohesion had largely been replaced by the pursuit of financial leverage. The broader economy was heavily overleveraged, dependent on massive, speculative real estate projects to artificially inflate local growth metrics. When Xi Jinping assumed the office of General Secretary in 2012, his immediate diagnosis was severe. He warned the Politburo that if rampant corruption was allowed to continue, it would doom both the party and the state. He pledged a relentless crackdown on the tigers and flies, meaning high-ranking political elites and grassroots civil servants alike. The leadership recognized that an organic dynasty cannot survive on capital alone. Maintaining their hold on the country required an immediate and rigorous reimposition of centralized order. The mechanism chosen for this consolidation is a doctrine known as self-revolution. It requires the party to continuously purge corrupt and ineffective elements from its own ranks to maintain party purity. To execute this, Xi empowered the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, an internal watchdog with the authority to bypass the formal judicial system. In 2018, this apparatus was formalized into state law with the creation of the National Supervisory Commission. This expanded comprehensive oversight beyond just party members to include all public office holders across the country. The scope of the purge reached the highest echelons of power. Former Chongqing Party chief Bo Xilai, once considered a top political contender, was removed from office and sentenced to life in prison. And then came the investigation into former National Security Chief Zhao Yongkang. His eventual life sentence shattered the norm of criminal immunity that had protected the highest-ranking officials for 3 decades. This campaign operates without an end date. It is a structural, aggressively maintained immune system designed to keep the political elite permanently in check. Civilian compliance is only one half of the equation. Centralized authority also requires firm control over the People's Liberation Army. The threshold for military protection vanished in early 2014 when General Xu Kai-ho, former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, was taken directly from his hospital sickbed to face prosecution for bribery. This chart tracks the initial shockwave evolving into a sustained, methodical clearance of the military command structure. Dozens of senior officers have been stripped of their rank and handed over for criminal prosecution over the last decade. In late 2023 and continuing through 2024 and 2025, the purges reached the Defense Ministry itself, resulting in the expulsion of Defense Minister Li Shangfu and Senior Admiral Miao Hua, effectively paralyzing existing factional networks. These expulsions were explicitly linked to accusations of political disloyalty, signaling that the state values ideological alignment over traditional military career paths. Beijing treats this internal discipline as a prerequisite for its broader national defense objectives. An armed force motivated by financial gain or loyal to individual commanders poses a systemic threat. The ongoing purges are meant to forge a military apparatus that serves the central command without hesitation. Applying this same level of control to the broader economy has required severe sacrifices. The state deliberately cut off the flow of easy credit to the bloated real estate sector, absorbing massive financial losses in the process. This animated line chart visualizes the resulting economic pivot. The decades of double-digit expansion are over. The national GDP growth rate has been actively guided down, settling at approximately 4.5% for 2026. Pressing down on the economic brakes has generated intense social friction. The national birth rate has fallen to record lows, and youth unemployment surged, reaching 15.6% in mid-2026. Millions of young adults are now entering a fiercely constrained labor market, competing for a shrinking pool of traditional corporate roles as the private sector contracts. Yet the state views this friction as a required transition cost. Capital and resources are being forcefully redirected away from consumer speculation and into strategic, state-backed priorities like artificial intelligence, green energy production, and high-tech manufacturing. Beijing is choosing to endure this acute domestic pain today, calculating that a tightly controlled, technologically self-reliant economy is the only way to withstand external trade pressures tomorrow. With internal control consolidated, China's posture toward the rest of the world has shifted. Deng Xiaoping's instruction to keep a low profile has been discarded. The current doctrine is framed as major country diplomacy. The state now openly asserts its status and demands an active role in shaping the international order to align with its own security and economic interests. The most visible physical manifestation of this outward projection is the Belt and Road Initiative. This global map tracks the sheer scale of the project, a multi-trillion-dollar web of infrastructure nodes, ports, and trade corridors spanning over 70 countries. It serves as an active conduit to export China's massive industrial overcapacity. By securing these strategic supply lines across Asia, Africa, and Europe, Beijing is actively reorganizing global development patterns away from traditional Western dominance. The state is now actively exporting its own centralized architecture to the developing world, building a parallel international system designed on its own terms. The anti-corruption purges, domestic economic restructuring, and overseas expansion are all interconnected. They are engineered mechanisms required to force order upon the system. The party leadership operates under the conviction that without an uncompromising grip on the nation's political and economic levers, their governance will inevitably succumb to historical cycles of internal decay. The era of chaotic, explosive opportunity defining China's late 20th century is closed. In its place stands an era defined entirely by strict, centralized discipline. China's ascent is an ongoing, systematic war against entropy, where uncompromising control is viewed as the only alternative to collapse.